between 1 to 2. Is that a room change and a time change?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a room change to room 5 in Studio B and a time change 1 till 2.
Yeah. Time change most importantly.
Time change is the most important. Okay, great. So the lecture I'm going to give today, it begins with a fairly heavy selection of quotations. So on the back of your slide list, I've put up all the quotations that I refer to in this PowerPoint. So before you start trying to manically write down everything that I've said, everything on the screen, you do actually have a copy of it. Okay, so this lecture borrows its title from an essay by the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. In it, he tries to think about what defines the contemporary, and he sees it linked to both time and place. So I'm going to discuss some different approaches to this idea of the contemporary and how this helps us to understand what's meant by contemporary art. In recent art historical writing, this is a topic that's been hotly debated, with definitions of the contemporary and contemporary art forming key arguments around how art practice relates to wider social and political landscapes. So I'm just going to focus on a sort of a small element within this after a kind of an overview of this term. So I'm going to look at the ways in which artists, writers and curators are returning to moments in recent history to help us define the contemporary moment. Whilst this might seem counterintuitive to turn from the past to understand the present, I hope to show how this approach to the contemporary helps to define what is meant by contemporary art. So, Agamben's essay begins by asking some questions. Of whom and of what are we contemporaries? And first and foremost, what does it mean to be contemporary? Now, rather than seeing these questions as having simple answers, he argues that to be contemporary, one has to be slightly out of step with time. So for him, to see the contemporary as a particular state, we have to be not completely one with it. He says, those who are truly contemporary, who truly belong to their time, are those who neither perfectly coincide with it, nor adjust themselves to its demands. Precisely through this disconnection and this anachronism, they are more capable than others of perceiving and grasping their own time. So, for Agamben, to think about the contemporary is to consider relationships between the past, the present and the future. In the joining of our own personal lifespan with the historical period we live in, there are always disconnections. Agamben says that the experience of seeing these disconnections is akin to staring at the darkness between the stars. Now, this is quite a complicated point, but it has interesting implications for our relationship to history. He says, what we perceive as the darkness of the heavens is this light that, though travelling towards us, cannot reach us, since the galaxies from which the light originates move away from us at a velocity greater than the speed of light. To perceive, in the darkness of the present, this light that strives to reach us but cannot, this is what it means to be contemporary. As such, contemporaries are rare. And for this reason, to be contemporary is, first and foremost, a question of courage, because it means being able not only to fix firmly your gaze on the darkness of an epoch, but also to perceive in this darkness a light that, while directed towards us, infinitely distances itself from us. In other words, it is like being on time for an appointment that one cannot but miss. Now, this is quite an enigmatic idea, and he goes on to think through a number of examples of how he conceptualises a contemporary, some more understandable than others. And the one that perhaps helps us to understand this appointment we cannot but miss is in his discussion of fashion. He talks about how being in fashion is always a fleeting moment that is either about to come into being or just past. So he asks us, how can you identify the now of fashion? He says, is this now perhaps the moment in which the fashion designer conceives of the general concept, the nuance that will define the new style of the clothes? Or is it the moment when the fashion designer conveys the concept to his assistants and then to the tailor who will sew the prototype? Or rather, is it the moment of the fashion show when the clothes are worn by the only people who are always and only in fashion, the mannequins or models, those who nonetheless, precisely for this reason, are never truly in fashion? So for him, the time of fashion constitutively anticipates itself and consequently is always too late. It always takes the form of an ungraspable threshold between a not yet and a no more. He says, the phrase, I am in this instant in fashion, is contradictory because the moment in which the subject pronounces it, he is already out of fashion. So, in this conception of the now of fashion, he's pointing to the way in which he sees the contemporary as being a moment that you can either be before or after, but to actually inhabit it is something very difficult and perhaps impossible. And so to use his ideas as a starting point, what might it mean to think about the now of art? In recent years, the term contemporary art has become ubiquitous, but it's also rather murky in its definition. As Mayer has looked at in his book, What Was Contemporary Art? Contemporary art itself has a history. As a periodisation, it is flexible. Sometimes when we refer to contemporary art, we mean art of this year, sometimes art from the last decade, sometimes within art history, it means art since 1989, or 1960, or 1945. So obviously each of these definitions changes our conceptualisation of what we mean by that term contemporary art. In the last few years, there's been a number of books that try to theorise or question the boundaries of contemporary art, and I'm just showing you a few here. So the reading is by Terry Smith. He's written a book called What is Contemporary Art, amongst others. Richard Mayer's What Was Contemporary Art, that looks at the kind of the ways in which the term contemporary art was conceptualised in the early 20th century around discussions around the MoMA in New York. And then you've got collections such as Contemporary Art 1989 to the Present, or a companion to contemporary art since 1945. And these authors and editors are all trying to grapple with their definition of what this historical time frame might be. But interestingly, what they nearly all point to is the fact that whatever time frame they give contemporary art, it's also a way of defining art made during a period of increasing globalisation. For many authors, the term contemporary art is one way of designating the plurality of art markets and art worlds that no longer can be defined by nation or movement. So to understand the contemporary within art requires understanding both the specific histories and places from which it arises. And this, I think, marks a shift from the conceptualisation of art movements. So during the 20th century, the terms modernism and postmodernism dominated definitions of Western art. But now both seem to be historical in some way, although their influence is still present. So in looking at Agamben and this kind of move within art historical writing, I want to think about this term contemporary as being quite a tricky term and something that is sort of critically being utilised at the moment. And the reading for this lecture kind of explores that in a few different directions than what I'm going to do in the lecture. And we might also think about how we are contemporaries with each other. So whilst we might be contemporaries as in being peers within the same time, we have very different historical and geographical frames of reference. So the tendency to think about the time and the place of the contemporary can be found within art and exhibitions that engage with recent histories as a way of kind of pointing out this kind of condition. So I want to start by going back to 1993. Now to me that doesn't seem that long ago, although it's now 20 years in the past. In 1993 I was 18. I'd finished high school on the Isle of Wight and I'd moved to Reading to begin my degree. I felt like an adult and was ready for my grown-up life to begin, away from family, away from my childhood on the coast. My eyes were on London, even though I wasn't quite there. I read magazines like Days of Confused and ID, pulling out images I thought were cool and pinning them on my bedroom wall, pictures like the ones you see here. Now, if we return to this moment in 93 and just before in 92, the images on the left, the two images, are from a fashion story by the German photographer Wolfgang Tillmans, who subsequently had a very successful career within art galleries. So at the time he was publishing a lot in magazines like ID. And this series is a fashion spread that played with androgyny and sexuality. He says about the series that he first started thinking about playing with the idea of male and female nudity in the early 90s. The fact fact is, he says, toplessness in a man is not equal to toplessness in a woman. For a man to experience the same level of exposure and commitment to the image as a woman posing topless, he must appear bottomless. And this was the principle behind my series, Like Brother, Like Sister. So for him, it was kind of an experiment in representation, like a sexualised representation of male and female bodies. But it also caused a scandal because of the level of nudity. And he talks about how, to the managers of W.H. Smith, however, the title referred to incest, like brother, like sister, and the images were obscene. The chain refused to stock that issue of ID, almost closing the magazine. So what starts off as a kind of experimental fashion shoot ends up sort of questioning the boundaries of what can be sold in a shop and what constitutes an obscene image. Now, this questioning of gender roles was played out in art, music and fashion. This was a period in which the dominance of the high glamour of supermodels and yuppiedom was supplanted by grunge, when Kate Moss took over the covers of the magazines and sparked debates around heroin chic. Here we see her photographed by the British photographer Corinne Day for British Vogue in a shoot that caused newspaper inches to be written about the grungy styling and the skinniness of the young Moss. So you see that this shoot is called Kate's Flat. So it's made sort of in a pointedly everyday way that's kind of in opposition to the sort of high gloss supermodel style that had become dominant during the 1980s. And now these don't seem particularly remarkable photographs, but at the time they seemed really shocking to be within a mainstream magazine such as Vogue. So it was kind of a crossover of the experimental approach of magazines like ID, The Face, and Days Confused, coming into the much broader circulation of Vogue. In the East End of London, the artists Tracy Emin and Sarah Lucas opened The Shop, which was part tongue-in-cheek, part serious, and now part of YBA legend. Emin and Lucas described the period as being a mashup of parties, being broke, and having art collectors popping by. This was reflected by the range of wares they sold, from t-shirts and ashtrays for a couple of quid, to a sculpture sold to the gallerist Anthony Doffey for the price of their rates bill, which is apparently £600. 5 years after Damien Hirst had organised the exhibition Freeze, which included Sarah Lucas and other recent graduates from Goldsmiths, the shop represented the beginnings of a massively successful contemporary art scene in London and the development of Shoreditch into a cultural centre. Calling themselves the Birds, Emin and Lucas transformed what it meant to be a woman artist, taking on the drunken, riotous persona of the maverick artist who was most often seen as a male preserve. The shop was part party hangout, part Duchampian update, and now it's part of contemporary arts history, with a piece of work that included badges from the shop, now in the Tate collection. So the documentation of the shop kind of emphasises its sort of DIY, lo-fi quality, but when you hear about the discussions around the shop and who was going, it was partly a kind of an underground kind of project. But then you also had art collectors coming who were already picking up on the YBA scene that was kind of emerging during this period. So it was kind of a moment of sort of crossover from something that might be seen as sort of fairly particular to a group of friends to being of interest to a wider and rich art collecting public. So even though I was there in 1993, very near, I visited London a lot, I was kind of interested in all these things that were going on, I wasn't part of this scene that was emerging in cities such as London and New York, unless reading about people in magazines counts. And now you might want to think about your own relationship to 1993. Some of you are babies, some of you are teenagers or adults, and it's possible that some of you weren't born. So we're all contemporaries in the sense of the Latin root of the word. So con meaning together and tempor meaning time. So we're kind of together with each other in time. But we're sharing the same time as each other right now. But our experience of this present and the recent past can be radically different. And if we follow Agamben to see what the contemporary means, we can't be completely together with time, but need to be able to see beyond it. So just a last quote from Agamben. The ones who can call themselves contemporary are only those who do not allow themselves to be blinded by the lights of the century and and so managed to get a glimpse of the shadows in those lights of their intimate obscurity. So why have I begun with 1993? The choice of this year is really because of an exhibition that took place at the New Museum in New York this year. It's an exhibition called NYC 1993 Experimental Jet Set, Trash and No Star. As the director of the New Museum remarks, Lisa Phillips, she says, "This is one of the first exhibitions to look back at the art of the 1990s. Like fashion, art is increasingly working on shorter and shorter cycles of influence, remixing and returning to periods that now feel sometimes uncomfortably near to our own. The exhibition focuses on a period I can clearly remember, but for many of you born in the 1990s, the material in this exhibition will be experienced for the first time as history rather than lived experience." In the exhibition catalogue, a number of writers begin with reminiscences similar to mine, discussing how their situation in '93 was defined both by their age and where they lived. The curators of the exhibition were also in their late teens in '93 and offer this explanation of why they wanted to recreate the New York art scene from that year. So this is the quote on the screen. Although this exhibition focuses on a specific time and place, it is essentially a kind of collective fiction. We each have a particular set of memories from the year 1993. However, we approach the organisation of the show from a position of non-participants in the New York art world that year. This led to extensive historical research, as well as mining the personal reminiscences and reflections of a number of individuals, whose involvement in the cultural and political activities of that moment were direct and varied. We hope that the works assembled provide a partial portrait of the issues at stake in that year and illuminate some of what has made the art created and exhibited at that time resonate with our current time. So here what they're emphasising is this idea of a collective fiction, and also New York as a particular place of cultural production being a kind of a fantasy that they're recreating. So although they have done historical research and interviews with people who were there in 1993, they acknowledge it's not actually possible to recreate what was happening in 1993 in any accurate sense, but instead they're focusing on this idea of it becoming this fantasy space that is relevant for now. So I think what the curators of this exhibition are interested in is what our fantasies about the past can tell us about the present. So in the exhibition there's a wide range of work that I'm not really going to cover, but I just want to point to a key exhibition that they refer to. So one of the key exhibitions is the 1993 Whitney Biennial. Now this biennial is now infamous for being focused on political art and also for introducing film and video into the Whitney Biennial for the first time. So the Whitney Museum of Art is another big museum in New York, and traditionally the biennial is a showcase of kind of new art, like what's new in American art. But this biennial, the curators chose to curate a series of work by artists that addressed issues of race, sexuality, gender and violence, as well as challenging the forms of art through the inclusion of time-based media. And so when this exhibition happened, a lot of the critics dismissed it as kind of political correctness gone wrong, or kind of being too excessively political in its kind of curatorial approach in the artwork selected. But since then, it's been seen as an important historical exhibition with resonance for a long time since. And one of the artworks that's most often talked about is a piece by Daniel Joseph Martinez. And what he did, he took the badges all the visitors had to wear to enter the exhibition and had them printed with Wordsmith's statement, "I can't imagine ever wanting to be white." So as a piece of participatory artwork, the visitor became part of the piece as he or she pinned the badge onto their clothes. Now you might take this as a humorous provocation or a deadly serious thought experiment that brings up the ways in which whiteness is the norm, a racial category that is rarely commented on, let alone is seen as undesirable. By being written on a badge that you have to wear to enter the exhibition, the work also drew attention to how racism is a condition that cannot be escaped. Now, the response to this work was one of hysterical condemnation. As the critic Jerry Saltz put it, and this is about responses to the biennial in general, he said, "People went batshit." Now, looking at this work 20 years later, its political and artistic aims do not feel historical, at least not to me. Instead, they are still relevant and speak to the struggles around racism that continue to the present. Another work that was included in the exhibition that caused controversy was an amateur video. Now, this wasn't a piece of contemporary art, but it was included as an important cultural document. So this is an amateur video of the racially motivated beating of Rodney King from 1991, and this shows 4 police officers beating the African-American man Rodney King. And at the trial, police officers were acquitted, which sparked riots in LA in '92 and ongoing debates around racism in the United States. By including this video in the biennial, it marked an engagement with the political situation in the US and also the role that new technologies would play. Now, in a world of YouTube and citizen journalism, the use of amateur video footage is no longer unusual. In the exhibition NYC 1993, political events and artworks are also brought together, focusing on the ways in which mass media forms the cultural landscape for artists emerging at this time. The themes that were addressed by artists and exhibitions 20 years ago are selected and replayed to see what resonance they hold now. In recent years, some very exciting exhibitions have followed this archival logic, where they've returned to a moment in time or a set of artworks from a previous historical moment that appear to speak to today. Just going to look at one last example. This is an exhibition from last year, curated by Helen Molesworth. The title is "This Will Have Been: Art, Love and Politics in the 1980s. Now, this covered the period from 1979 and went up to 92. It brought together artists rarely seen together, from activist posters by Grand Fury to paintings by Gerhard Richter and David Sall to photographs by Laurie Simmons. And the title, "This Will Have Been," takes us into the time of the work on show and tries to make the historical material contemporary, make it part of our own peer group in conversation with us now. At the tense of the title, "This Will Have Been," it's like in the future perfect, places us within the 1980s looking towards the future. The exhibition graphics picture disparate artists together. So on the right-hand side, this is one of the graphics from the exhibition. You've literally got the artists as a group of contemporaries. So you've got Basquiat overlaid with Sherman, Mapplethorpe, Koons and Golding. And in terms of writing on these artists and where they're situated, they're seen as kind of having very different practices. But this exhibition, in focusing on the 1980s, brings them together, and that might have kind of sort of useful critical resonances, or it might just end up sort of being a blurring of what's particular about those artists' works. So obviously for the curator, bringing them together has a critical purchase. And what she tries to do is really situate the 1980s within the politics of the period in the United States, particularly being the period of the AIDS crisis and the Thatcher-Reagan years, and sort of the sort of backlash against the various sort of political rights movements of the 60s and 70s. Now, this kind of background of a political situation is pictured in the exhibition by the inclusion of General Ideas AIDS wallpaper. You can see on the right-hand side here on one of the walls. So this becomes a natural ground for some of the other artworks. And when you sort of go through the rooms, like in the picture on the left, it becomes in conversation with objects such as Jeff Koons's rabbit, which wouldn't normally be seen in proximity. Like the exhibition NYC 1993, the shift represented by a generation of artists who'd grown up with mass media, namely TV, became another important theme, as well as the question of how to make politically engaged art in a time of crisis. And so in this exhibition, there's kind of, it's sort of had mixed reviews as to whether its kind of political intent is really kind of carried through in the realisation of the project. But there's some replayings of artworks that have very sort of similar political kind of responses, I guess. So at the top here, you've got a piece by Grand Fury, Kissing Doesn't Kill, Reading Indifference Do, which was made in 1989 and was designed to be displayed in public spaces. When it was first made, it caused for it either to be defaced or sort of asked to be taken down. And apparently when this was also put up, I think on Chicago buses, when this exhibition was in Chicago, again the poster was defaced again. So there isn't a sense in which it's simply a historical document. It's still actively engaging sort of public ire in a way that it had done 20 years later. So in some ways it kind of points to the way in which the issues that were kind of dominant during the 1980s are still unresolved in the present. And I think Helen Molesworth is trying to find a way to use the exhibition as a way of kind of asking how to perhaps use this history to kind of push forward in the present. So this idea of a kind of an exhibition as a time capsule or an archive is something that has been discussed within contemporary art for a few years. An important article around this idea of creating some sort of archive in art has been proposed in Hal Foster, the American art historian and critic, in his essay An Archival Impulse from 2004. So here he talks about an active engagement with history, with artists, he defines archival artists who seek to make historical information, which is often lost or displaced, physically present, and that they're concerned less with absolute origins than with obscure traces. These artists are often drawn to unfulfilled beginnings or incomplete projects, in art and in history alike, that might offer points of departure again. So there's a sense here that by returning to something that's happened in history but perhaps has not been fulfilled in that historical moment, maybe something can be made of it now that kind of either completes it or changes it, or and often in a lot of artists' work it becomes like a fictional space as well. Now in that essay he discusses a number of artists, but one of them is the Swiss artist Thomas Hirschhorn. And Thomas Hirschhorn has made a series of ephemeral altars, monuments and kiosks in honour of various artists, writers and philosophers. Here I'm showing you one made in honour of the modernist painter Pierre Mondrian, put together in the manner of roadside commemoration for someone who has died. So rather than this being an institutionally endorsed archive, the archival impulse that Foster explores is focused more on emotional, intuitive connections with a collection of information. So they're often privileging sort of ephemeral or kind of throwaway elements and bringing them together to kind of make them sort of held within history. So here, Hirschhorn, I think, is taking the idea of artistic influence, so which artists have influenced you and why, and performs it as an act of devotion. This is in contrast to the Oedipal act of erasure that Stephen showed you before Reading Week, where Robert Rauschenberg erased a drawing by William de Kooning. Still, this act is not straightforwardly honouring a past artist, as the form of the altar is at odds with the modernist principles that guided Mondrian's own art practice. Here, within the creation of Mondrian as a saint at an altar, or a destiny mourns, transforms his image within our historical imagination, foregrounding both his actual demise and the demise of his style of artistic practice. So for Foster, he says, these kinds of private archives do question public ones. They can be seen as perverse orders that aim to disturb the symbolic order at large. So, in an artwork by the filmmaker Cheryl Dunye and the photographer Zoe Leonard, a fictional archive is created to draw attention to the absences in many public archives. In the film The Watermelon Woman, you see a poster for it on the left-hand side, Cheryl Dunye plays herself, trying to track down information about an African-American actress, Faye Richards, who was in Hollywood in the 1920s to the 50s. And the film is apparently a documentary, and it shows Dunye discovering that Faye Richards was a lesbian, and in the 1920s had an affair with a white director. You see having a picnic with her on the bottom right there. And before settling down into a long-term relationship. The film charts Dunye engaging with various experts and archives in her attempt to piece together Richard's life. The film appears to be real, like about a real person called Faye Richards, but at the end it's revealed that it's actually a construction, a story, a fiction. Faye Richards is not a real actress, but a fantasy formed for the film. So she becomes a figure to discuss a history of a particular moment, both a history of gay and lesbian lives in the early 20th century that might not be present within official histories, but also a history of being a black actress in a period where in mainstream Hollywood the only roles that she can get is either as a maid or a mammy character, and then it charts her kind of movement into a black-owned studio and kind of films made for a very small budget, but trying to provide an alternative representation of black lives. And so this isn't a person that really exists, but it's somebody who allows Cheryl Dunye and Zoe Leonard to talk about a history that is otherwise repressed or absent. So I want to look at another couple of artists who employ this archival logic in their work to create fantastical or fictional relationships with the past from a queer perspective. Anne Chetkovich, in her book An Archive of Feeling, there's just some pictures there, has discussed how lesbian and gay histories often utilise unorthodox forms of archiving. She says, in the absence of institutionalised documentation or in opposition to official histories, memory becomes a valuable historical resource, and ephemeral and personal collections of objects stand alongside the documents of the dominant culture in order to offer alternative modes of knowledge. In the context of institutional histories of erased or ignored lesbian and gay histories, the urgency to document them or imagine them in the present is particularly urgent. So for me, this kind of return to the past to kind of understand the contemporary can be quite pointed in a number of political ways. So I'm just exploring one here within a history of queer lives and queer politics, but this is not by any means the only way in which historical moments have been reactivated in the present. So I want to start with a couple of works by the American artist Sharon Hayes. A series that kind of sort of brought her to attention, I guess, to an international art scene is a project called In the Near Future. Again, notice the way in which we're situated, maybe in the past looking to the future, or we're having to imagine what our future might be. There's kind of a shifting of time in the very title here. In the near future, she's taken signs from various demonstrations from the 60s and 70s and 80s, and then stands with a sign at a site of a different protest, a one-woman recreation of a moment of resistance. She's talked about how this is an ongoing series, and she's done it in a number of cities, so I'm just showing you this, which took place in New York in 2005. How the sign, the sites, and the people who come past all join together. And she's discussed about how if people stop her, she'll talk about the protest that is referred to on the sign and also the site on which she's standing. And if you notice, when you look at the pictures, none of these places appear to be particularly memorialised sites. So the places which she is standing on do not appear evidently part of a political past. So she's kind of finding invisible places, and then by standing there, she becomes a sort of a passing monument to that. And also, by holding these different signs, she's referring to protests that might not involve herself, but kind of she's speaking them for the public, who mostly seem to walk past her without much interest or a bit of amusement. She's described the project as a set of anachronistic and speculative actions in an ongoing investigation into the figure of the protester. So she's using this term anachronistic, which is one of the terms that Agamben uses in his discussion of the contemporary. And the photographs show a kind of a melancholy and also perhaps absurd project of a one-woman protest in a busy street. Here the dream of collective action is replayed through the single figure, an image of resistance that is ignored by the passerby. And the kind of the historical context of 2005 is kind of after the huge amount of anti-war demonstrations and kind of anti-capitalist demonstrations in the early years of the century, which felt like, although there was a massive public kind of collective sort of anger and resistance, politically it wasn't recognised. So there was a sense in which, does protest, does demonstration, does it still operate, which is maybe a different context now in the wake of kind of Occupy. Hayes replays this kind of use of protest in a collective form in a more recent project called Revolutionary Love, I'm Your Worst Fear, I'm Your Best Fantasy, 2008. In this piece, it's two performances that took place at the Democratic and also the Republican conventions in the US. She invited people from the local community to come and join her to speak a collective text, which is effectively a love letter. And she asked for people who identified as queer and also to dress up in whatever they imagined queer to be. So the kind of the range of people there kind of are from just their everyday clothes to kind of historical renditions of what might be seen as kind of you've got like a Lesbian Avengers t-shirt up there. There's sort of various kind of fairly camp outfits, but they're all kind of crammed together. There's no kind of curation of these historical expressions, and they kind of take place with people just dressed in what they wear every day. The subtitle of the performance it was taken from a placard that Hayes originally saw in a film, and that's a photograph of it there. And then she came across it in an archive. And so here an archive is brought to life, animated for the present. She said about the process, the whole project of archiving, of documenting that we have a past, is in actuality a desire for the future, no? So in this piece, you can see all the people speaking, and if you want to hear what they're saying, you go to her gallery's website, the Tanya Layton website. It's got the audio track and also video from this piece. The collective text is, first of all, simply a kind of a personal love letter addressed to a lover who doesn't seem to want to be with the person who's speaking anymore. But it's also being read as a kind of a sort of a mournful address to a political system, or an address to a friend or to a community. So the people who are being addressed are kind of as ambiguous as a group speaking together. But she's interested in the ways in which speech and repetition, reenactment and fantasy can create kind of moments of kind of resistance or contemplation in the present moment. And on the right hand side, there is apparently a moment in the Democratic Convention where there's a Christian rights demonstration that kind of crossed over with their group of people, and apparently there was a sort of, this is just what Hayes recounts, there's a sort of standoff, and then Hayes begins the text, and then the Christian right demonstration just walks on past, because what they're protesting, like Hayes' group is protesting, is so ambiguous as to they can't really take them head on. So that's also an interesting moment of kind of unchoreographed kind of interaction. So I want to move from Hayes' reimagining of political history to Simon Fujiwara's reimagining of his own history. Now, he's an artist who's performed fictionalised histories throughout his career. He had a major exhibition at the Tate St Ives last year, and he titled it Since 1982. Now, rather than this referring to works made since 1982, as would be imagined in an artist's retrospective, the title referred to the date of Fujiwara's birth. In this way, the theme of the exhibition, Fujiwara's life story, in its combination with other historical eras, was set. And even in the film, like the interview with him, you know, kind of in the reading room at the end of the exhibition, you weren't quite sure whether Simon Fujiwara was being Simon Fujiwara, or whether he was performing a kind of the character, the artist. And he says in that interview, all biographies are to some extent invented. And he often uses kind of what at first appear to be publicity photos as part of a kind of a whole collection of material he generates around various installations. So one of the pieces is called Welcome to the Hotel Mumbar. And here he created an installation of a Spanish bar from the 1970s, which is replete with sexually evocative, surrealist-inspired sculptures. And this bar is a setting for Fujiwara's erotic stories, which imagine his father in a series of homoerotic encounters. Now, he initially performed this piece as a lecture, and often his pieces take some form of address, whether as a film or a live presentation. And in the lecture, it first of all appears to be a fairly straightforward one, where he talks about how his parents owned a bar in the 1970s in Spain, and his kind of research into this, and he discusses how he's trying to write an erotic story based on this bar, which was placed in Franco's Spain, and how his research revealed how homosexuality was illegal during this period. So homosexual literature and imagery was heavily censored. So in creating erotic stories in the last days of Franco's reign, he brings to life a repressed or absent history of queer sexuality. Now he does this in a humorous manner, as the stories are about his father's homosexual encounters, as well as with the kind of the eroticised architecture of this bar. So this is an act of aggressively fictionalising the past that doesn't kill the father, but instead writes about him having sex. So perhaps this is a kind of ironic reverse Oedipal scenario. And in Fujiwara's work, the sexual and the artistic are brought together in surreal ways, often in the forms of presentation that first appear to be factual. In another work, The Mirror Stage, he films himself talking to a child actor who's being prepared to play him at age 11. The story that Fujiwara wants him to enact is about a young boy himself going to the opening of the Tate St. Ives and being overwhelmed by a Patrick Heron painting. And in the top left, you see the installation as it was in Tate St. Ives, and you have the actual Patrick Heron painting, and then the film, and one on the left-hand side, and you see stills from that film. I think that might be from a performance of the piece. So the boy goes to the opening of the Tate St. Ives, age 11. He sees a Patrick Heron painting and is overwhelmed. But then Fujiwara turns this, you imagine it's going to be a moment of creative inspiration, but he tells how his boy self gets an erection in front of the painting, and this confirms his gay identity. At this point in the story, the viewer realises that again, this is a queer, surreal fiction. Bringing together autobiography with the Tate St. Ives, sexuality with artistic creativity, Fujiwara's film and installation weave together a story that fictionalises an encounter with an artwork that includes an IKEA duvet supposedly based on Heron's artwork, a dialogue between Patrick Heron and Francis Bacon, and a reflection on acting as lying. So within these pieces, there's kind of a huge compressing of material that play with these different levels of kind of research, autobiography, and fiction. So in the artist's works that I've shown, there's a focus on history as a space of fantasy and transformation and resistance. By engaging with history as both personal and political, they address ways in which the present might be reconfigured in the light of a different past. And as contemporary art starts to address the question of its history in a global context, the multiplication of archives and reenactments offer ways in which to think through the narratives that are given as a backdrop to art now. I just want to make a final point about this kind of use of the archive in its kind of expanded form. Perhaps archives are literally a way to think about contemporary art and its political histories, perhaps more so than exhibitions. A recent project, the Mayday Rooms, set up in London in 2011, is both a physical archive and a springboard for activity. Its website allows for widespread access to archival material, which includes videos and information about lectures and workshops, as well as historical documents. In this way, new technologies have changed our relationship with time and history, allowing us different kinds of access to historical material. The Mayday Rooms continues what's been happening in contemporary art in the idea of how fosters archival impulse, so that histories are opened up and made available for the present and the future. And just I'll read out their kind of sort of mission statement. Mayday Rooms is a safe house for vulnerable archives and historical material linked to social movements, experimental culture and marginalised figures and groups. A site for gathering, holding and animating documents and idioms of dissent which continue to offer a critically productive and emancipatory relation to the turbulent present. It is geographically located in central London, but linked in collaboration, inspiration and practice with an international gathering of common and concurrent initiatives. Much of the material in the Mayday Rooms is concerned with political projects from around the time of 1968 that Edgar Schmidt referred to last week, that challenged capitalist notions of work and learning. There is material, for instance, from the collection of the writer Silvia Federici in the middle, whose writing on women's work as forms of immaterial labour led to her involvement in the International Wages for Housework project. And so here you've got both a video of her being interviewed about the period of the mid-70s, and there's also a sort of a range of material that's been uploaded from this collection on the website, so you can engage with it without having to physically visit the archive. So rather than the archive being somewhere where material is put away and only accessible to specialist researchers, it becomes something that is kind of easily searchable. And then other projects include radical pedagogical projects such as the Anti-University or the A course, which were both begun in the 1960s and have been used as a springboard for current work by the Mayday Rooms. So here you see kind of a blackboard from a workshop around the Anti-University, and on the right-hand side you see a newspaper that was produced in response to these workshops and engagement by a number of scholars with material around the Anti-University. And it says download the tabloid as PDF here, so it's kind of easily accessible if you want to go and have a look at that material. So here the unfulfilled possibilities of various revolutionary moments, including feminism, are brought to life for now, an appointment that might have been missed, but is nonetheless influencing the present. So now the project is to decide on what the contemporary means for you, which histories you draw upon, and how you might embody them. Rather than seeing the contemporary as the new, perhaps it is better to see the contemporary as a fiction, one which brings together moments in history and across places for the now.